Key elements of the Cold War, 1944 to 1991. One of the key ideas of the Cold War was the Iron Curtain, the border between the Warsaw Pact in the east, or the Soviet-dominated forces, and the NATO forces in the west, or those led by the United States and Britain and France. So basically there was this huge accumulation of military forces on both sides, conventional weapons, meaning like tanks and infantry and things like that, and also nuclear weapons. And those two forces, those two sides, the Warsaw Pact versus NATO, faced each other down for a very long time, from 1944 to 1991. And so the Iron Curtain was basically this border, which I'm highlighting right here. And along this border was basically the combined arms of both of the two blocks of forces, the communist forces of the Soviet Union, and then the democratic, mostly, although some dictatorships, and capitalistic countries of Western Europe and obviously the United States. So the Iron Curtain was basically the place where nuclear war was very likely to occur, and luckily did not. So one of the things that really defines the Cold War is the nuclear arms race, and you can see that in this graph here. And basically it was a nuclear arms race between the United States, the blue colors here, and the Soviets, in the red colors here, although they become the Russians after 1991. And there were, however, also nuclear armed countries of the United Kingdom and France who were our allies. Eventually the Chinese developed their own nuclear weapons, and those were communist weapons, although they weren't particularly aimed at us so much as probably aimed at the Russians. And then over time, although not really part of the Cold War, the Israelis, the Indians, the Pakistanis, and the North Koreans also developed nuclear weapons. But basically you can see that in the early Cold War, the United States had the lead in nuclear warheads. We were way out ahead. The Soviets took a while, but eventually actually built more warheads than we did. But at a certain point between us and the Soviets, at the very height of the Cold War, you can see that we had more than 60,000 nuclear devices, which is a truly enormous number of nuclear weapons. And then you can tell that after the Cold War began to end in 1991, the number of nuclear weapons began to decline as they were not so needed. Although we do still, between us and the Russians and some of the other countries, have 10,000 nuclear warheads in total on the planet still today. And a key part of making nuclear weapons work is to be able to deliver them. And so both sides, and also the French and the British and the Chinese and the Israelis today and the Pakistanis and the Indians today, now use what is called a strategic triad, which means you use 3 different ways to deliver your nuclear weapons to make sure that you always have a retaliatory possibility. So if the other guy decides to strike you, you need to have enough weapons left even after you get hit that you can basically inflict damaging punishment on your opponent, and therefore make it so that they do not want to attack you. So you need to have a good way of delivering nuclear weapons even after you've been struck. And so basically most countries use the nuclear triad, or the strategic triad. So bombers, usually B-52s back during the Cold War, although we have stealth bombers today, but B-52s, which were, I believe, invented in 1952, are still flying today, and they were the primary strategic bomber of the United States. The Soviets have their own version, and then the Russians obviously due to Chinese, British, French, you name it. Most countries that have nuclear weapons also use nuclear armed submarines, which launch ballistic missiles out of the subs. And those subs basically just go hide around at the bottom of the ocean and wait in case something goes wrong, which is kind of an interestingly boring job, where you sit at the bottom of the ocean hiding and then waiting to destroy large parts of the human population in revenge should your own country be struck. And finally, there are a lot of missiles, just straight out land-based missiles. These are the missiles that eventually became part of the space race, as both the United States and the Soviets needed to build very large weapons capable of hitting the other side of the planet. And so going to the moon or going to space was a good way to kind of practice what was really weaponry designed to kill everyone, which was intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. So if you have a good strategic triad, you have all 3 of these kinds of weapons, then you will be able to deliver your nuclear weapons when they are needed, which hopefully they never will be. Both sides also built enormous numbers of conventional weapons, which is non-nuclear weapons. And so this was a big part of the war and a very expensive part of the war. So in order to make it so the other guy wouldn't even risk like a non-nuclear war, which might become a nuclear war, you had to have very large numbers of tanks and aircraft and infantry and all kinds of other stuff so that you could keep the other guy from attacking you in any way, shape, or form. And therefore, there would be no risk of a nuclear war starting. You can see that the Warsaw Pact, or the Soviets, generally had a lot more forces, although we also had much better technology here in the West, so that's a little less uneven than it seems. And given the fact that there were nuclear weapons, it was a fairly we had enough to make sure that the Soviets wouldn't attack us, and that combined with nuclear weapons kept a war from breaking out in Europe, which actually has not occurred since 1945, a major war in Europe. So nuclear weapons and these bizarre arms standoff does seem to have worked to bring a very long period of peace in Europe, which is extremely unusual. And both the Soviets and the US-led capitalists, sometimes democratic or often democratic, sides did force the third world to choose sides. So the first world was the United States, France, Britain, Western Europe. The second world was the communist world, the USSR, China, that kind of place. And then the third world was everybody else. And both sides, meaning the Warsaw Pact and NATO, or the Soviets and the United States, wanted everyone on the planet on their team. So you can see the red team, which was smaller. You had a few African countries, and there were often communist uprisings in various places like Indonesia and various countries within Africa over time to try and make more communist countries, Cuba being the most important one for the communists. And the United States also kind of lined up everybody we could line up, a lot of African countries, pretty much all of South America, Australia, obviously, and parts of Asia in order to make sure that we had as many resources and friends on our team as humanly possible. So it kind of sucked if you were a third world country, an African country, a South Asian country, Southeast Asian country, or a Latin American country, because you couldn't really have your own local politics. You could, but you were constantly getting pulled into Cold War politics. For instance, the United States had a really horrifying habit of supporting some pretty evil dictators, actually quite evil dictators, in South America, particularly in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, various places where we supported full-on dictators to avoid communist takeovers in South America. Same sort of thing happened in Africa with some terrible people who were supported by the United States, the British, the French, in order to keep the communists from controlling parts of Russia. The communists did the exact same thing. They supported all kinds of evil people. And so it really did kind of make the rest of the world that was neither communist nor capitalist nor interested in that Cold War fight kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You really couldn't avoid the Cold War no matter how hard you tried, anywhere on the planet. And the last point I'll make in this lecture is that there were a ton of proxy wars. And proxy wars are the kinds of things that made the Cold War bloody. We tend to think of the Cold War as a not hot war, meaning people didn't actually shoot each other. And that is true between the United States and the Soviet Union, or between the French and the British and the United States and the Soviet Union, because had that kind of shooting started, you and I would all be dead. There would have been a nuclear war because once you start shooting some people, especially if you start losing, you're going to feel the need to use nuclear weapons in order to, keep from losing. And once you even think of using nuclear weapons, the other guy's going to think you're going to use nuclear weapons, and so they will try and hit you first. So basically, the Cold War stayed cold because of mutually assured destruction. Everybody was terrified of being nuked. However, in a lot of third world countries, meaning countries that were not already communist or already part of the US-led capitalist, usually democratic forces, although not always, there were a lot of little wars, which actually were quite big wars very often, that were between basically sides of countries, civil wars often, or wars between countries, where the United States might support one side and the Soviets might support the other. Vietnam, Korea, various fighting regions in Africa, some particularly brutal insurgencies and counterinsurgencies that happened in South and Central America. So there was a lot of actual fighting, dying, and killing that occurred during the Cold War. The United States lost a lot of people and killed an enormous number of people in Vietnam in order to keep Vietnam from becoming a communist country. So definitely, you know, we lost people, we killed people in huge numbers. And that was part of the Cold War. It was a proxy war, though. We weren't fighting the Russians directly, although a lot of the arms and support that the North Vietnamese got eventually came from the communist side. Same thing happened in Korea. We did the exact same thing to the Soviets in Afghanistan, where we supported the Mujahideen in order to kill a ton of Russian forces or Soviet forces. So that was blood being shed. So the Cold War was not a non-violent war in any way, shape, or form. It was just not directly violent between the Soviet Union and the United States, because that would have led to nuclear war. So we used proxies, let other people kill some of our enemy. Both sides did that. And that made that idea that nobody in the third world could escape the Cold War even more brutal. So it wasn't just you were kind of being leaned on to be part of the Cold War. Sometimes there was active shooting going on in your country in proxy wars. That was the Cold War experience for people in South America, Africa, and much of Asia, south of China. And that's it for the basics of this lecture. Thank you.